Yeah. That's what it looks like to get put on my quad lock. That's better. Mehdi Hasan versus 20 far-right activists. It's presented by Jubilee. It's a debate show. Well, it's marketed as a debate show. If you're not aware of it, if you haven't heard of it before, if you don't know what it's about, they take one recognized, educated individual, such as Mehdi Hasan, who someone who has credentials, someone who's studied, someone who's had experience in relevant fields, and they've got education, they've got knowledge, they've got experience, they've got all these things to back their point of view, and their point of view has been rigorously tested, not only by themselves but by their field, and it generally tends towards the left. Won't get into that right now. And they set this one individual up in a room. There's a small desk and 2 chairs, and there's another 20 chairs surrounding them in a circle. And they have this one individual, and they bring in 20 individuals who hold the opposite perspective. More often than not, it's a perspective from the right. More often than not, it's a perspective from the far right. And the premise is that I feel like the original premise, what it was supposed to be, was, can 20 people with perspective B collectively change the mind of an individual with perspective A? A being the left, B being the right. And I feel like originally it may have been pushed forward as a way to kind of expose the invalidity of a lot of the arguments that those on the far right have. To be able to put forward a session, and at the end of the session we can go, well, 20 people weren't able to change one person's mind, with a discussion in a controlled setting. The problem with it, like the potential original purpose of it, I don't see as problematic. What I see as problematic is the way I view it now, and that is, more often than not, the 20 don't change their minds, and the one doesn't change their mind. And so it's there's no result, there's no resolution, there's no compromise, there's no consensus. It is literally just essentially a recording of a conversation, an argument, in the layman's sense. It's an argument, where neither party admits defeat. And that's where I find fault. That's where I find fault, because it's like, if no one on the right's admitting that they're wrong, and the individual on the left isn't admitting that they're wrong, what's the point? What's the point? And of course, you could just say entertainment, right? People like to watch people argue. Sure. But watching them argue about topics that are so critical in the humanities, in society, right? These are in the episode of Marty Hassan, there was a lot of talk about immigration policy in America. That is to say that Marty Hassan referenced the policy, and everyone else just said that, you know, immigrants should leave. There. What I see from it is that a lot of people of the right do not. It exposes their lack of supporting arguments. They say that immigrants should be deported. Okay. Why? You know, and then they say, oh, because they're taking jobs, they're taking housing, they're taking government resources. And then the evidence gets produced. The statistics get produced that that's not the case. And then those on the right say, oh, that's not valid evidence. Why is it not valid evidence? Why is that not valid? Fake news. It could have been fabricated. It could have been, you know, AI generated. It could have come from anywhere. You could have typed that up at home on your computer. Like, okay, then how do we validate any evidence? How do we find a resource that's reliable? At some point, we have to submit to a higher authority, a consensus of people in power. And the picture I get in my mind is that those on the right in America say that that authority is Donald Trump himself, the individual. And the very concept itself, let alone the act of it, the very concept itself is rife with opportunities for corruption. And I can't think of a single situation where a concept such as that would not be abused. Anyway, I get the feeling that the reaction to this particular episode has been is this helpful? Is this in some way beneficial? Is having these discussions on this platform in any way having any positive effect? My answer to that question is, well, no, absolutely not. Because the way these discussions take place, there's no allocated time for each speaker. It's literally a bell rings and the first person to sit into that chair is the one who gets to occupy that time with their discussion until they get voted out by the people in the circle. And that's not conducive. what I think should be happening. In order to take this idea and turn it into something that is beneficial, you have allocated time. You have rules and structure in place that stipulate you do not interrupt the other person while they're speaking. There needs to be an unbiased adjudicator. There needs to be someone who remains objective and says, right, you're talking out of turn, you raised these points, but you didn't address these points. They addressed these points, but you didn't address any of them, right? They produced this argument, you haven't addressed it. You were requested to provide evidence and sources for this, you haven't. Like, things like that are what's missing, I think. And if that was a requirement, I think you'd find a lot less people willing to take the seat. Because the things you'd need to produce don't exist and can't be produced, and therefore you would end up, at the end of your allocated time, you would end up with a whole lot of things that you haven't addressed, you haven't provided evidence for, and you haven't supported. And the individual on the left would have addressed everything you said, or requested evidence to support it, or things like that. And there'd be a whole lot of requests from the left and a whole lot of blank space on the right in terms of answers. And of course, my perspective of this particular scenario is filtered purely through TikTok, right? I've only seen what has come up on my For You page. And it's certainly biased towards the left, because they're my views, they're the videos I like, because they make sense, they're logical, they're reasonable, they prioritize reducing harm to every individual. And that certainly results in me having blind spots that I'm not aware of. And I find it really interesting that the concept that I find it really interesting that this concept of, okay, this discussion isn't really going anywhere, let's try and introduce some structure to make it go somewhere, hasn't been picked up yet by the mainstream media. Journalism, news outlets, broadcast television. It seems to be purely in the academic circles where this concept is taken up. It makes me think about, okay, so what's the difference? What's the difference between the academic circles and production media, right? What is the difference? And to me, the most obvious and most prominent difference would be their purpose. The purpose of academia is to educate, to learn, to expand knowledge and understanding. Whereas the purpose of production media is to entertain. And yes, you still have things like the news, which presents itself with the purpose of being to inform. And to a certain extent, they do. They do inform. But that's all they do. They inform. Mr. Smith said X. Mrs. Jones said Y. Event occurred. People are reacting in this way. They do that. I cannot say that they don't do that. However, it is very, very heavily supported with their secondary purpose, which is to entertain. Now, I don't mean that by they are going out of their way to produce entertaining content. What I mean by that is they're driven by ratings. They're driven by how many people are watching. They're driven by how many people prefer their particular brand compared to others. And I think that's becoming more and more dominant in today's society, where especially with capitalism being the system that we operate in, and these brands being businesses that need to turn a profit in order to keep the shareholders happy, I feel we are going to end up moving more and more towards that entertainment. And it will end up being much more than simply dramatizing, sensationalizing. I feel that it will move much further than that. And it's an interesting problem to solve, like whether it's happening or not. This is just my perspective. It's an interesting problem to solve, because how do you even without saying, well, this is the world we live in, right? Let's imagine a scenario where it's capitalism and you have a business who informs the public of events. It's hard. I think it's a very, very difficult challenge to find a motivation for that business to report perspectives the population does not want to hear. The population does not find entertaining. It becomes very difficult for them to, especially when there's multiple businesses competing, and the one who's winning is the one who's getting the most profits, because the most profits means the most views, which means that more and more people are being informed by that brand. So in order to raise profits, you need to raise your entertainment value. In order to raise your entertainment value, do you compromise? Because it seems that it seems like fewer and fewer of the people who are supposed to be informing the public are willing to stand up and say, well, what you've just said is wrong. And there's an element of cancel culture, there's an element of fake news, whatever. I would very much like to see academia play a larger role in informing the public. And I feel that critical thinking skills, learning to question your own opinions, and the willingness to invalidate your own perspective, has fallen by the wayside. It's not a common skill from what I'm seeing, from my perspective, my experience. What I'm seeing and experiencing a lot is that people are holding a particular view without any justifiable cause or reason, but they know that they're right. And even when presented with direct evidence that contradicts that view, they refuse to change. They refuse to acknowledge it. And the direct result of a lot of this is that people are being harmed. And I'm not yet able to see any benefits coming from any of it. And over the recent years, the popularity of these views, especially in America, has increased. Here in Australia, I see it has increased, not to the same extreme. And that isn't to say that the general public. This is like the people who are in charge. And you know, by relation, like the people who voted for them to be in charge. And I feel like our Western culture is partly to blame for that, in which, you know, tying into capitalism, being right is more important than learning from when you're wrong. And I make that connection through the concept that in capitalism, if people believe that you're right, they will spend the money. If people believe that you're wrong, they won't spend the money. It doesn't actually matter if you're right or wrong. And that's the role of marketing, to convince you to spend the money. Thinking out loud.